how's the songwriting going? Fiona Clark woke up and checked her smartphone, finding a message from Ethan Wright's agent at the top. She didn't reply, and he didn't follow up, unsure if it was trust in her dedication or a lack of concern on his part. Over the years, Fiona had always been reliable, never causing Ethan's new songs to be delayed, so his agent's lack of urgency was understandable. After all, most people close to them vaguely suspected she liked him and knew almost every lyric she wrote was for him, but no one had voiced it to Ethan. This time though, perhaps due to her illness, she couldn't write anything. Fiona opened her messaging app, e.g., iMessage, WhatsApp, tapped on Ethan's profile picture, hesitated, then backed out. Finally, she went back in and gritted her teeth, sending, "I have a fever." It was a low-grade fever, 99.9 degrees Fahrenheit. She would sweat at night, the temperature rising and falling, her head a mess. She was too sick to even think. Without thinking, how could she be dramatic? And without being dramatic, how could she write lyrics? Those who wrote sad songs always needed to indulge in their sadness. After sending the message, Fiona fell asleep again, her dreams muddled, filled with nightmares, cold sweat breaking out repeatedly, then baking into hot flashes in the stuffy bed. When she woke up again, it was past 4 a.m. Her pajamas were almost soaked. Fiona got up to change, then lay back in the slightly warm bed with a hint of aversion, suspecting it was damp. She checked her smartphone and saw the message she'd sent at 11 p.m. hadn't been replied to until midnight. It seemed Ethan wasn't having fun even while she was sick, his work schedule packed until almost midnight. Ethan's reply was restrained and polite. "The weather is getting colder, easy to get sick. Remember to see a doctor and don't take medicine randomly." Considerate and thorough, but also formally polite. They'd known each other for 5 years, worked together for 3. And for the past 6 months, they'd even shared a bed. She was definitely more than just an ordinary friend to Ethan, Fiona was confident of that. But precisely because they weren't ordinary friends, Ethan was so stingy with warmth, afraid that too moving words would blur the lines and create chaos. Fiona understood Ethan too well, realizing that in a way, it was because he valued her as a friend that he kept his distance from her as a woman. Half a year ago, that night had been an accident. Ethan's new album was a huge success, and Fiona was a valuable contributor. Ethan hated having to dress up and hide from reporters, so he prepared alcohol at his place and invited a few close people for hot pot. At the table, Fiona sat next to Ethan and was toasted countless times until they were both drunk. After everyone else had left, they were still there, clinking glasses. One thing was certain, the more alcohol they drank, the later the night became, and the easier it was to be sad. Two sad people together were bound to do something foolish. Fiona couldn't really say who had made the first move. The atmosphere was so charged that sometimes just a fleeting loss of control in the eyes was enough to signal the start. And the memories of drunks were unreliable. Fiona felt terrible when she woke up the next day. Before she could be completely shut down, she took the initiative to act nonchalant, as if she hadn't invested any feelings that night, but was just seeking warmth and comfort in a city where it was hard to find a soulmate. She could see Ethan's tightly drawn jawline relax a little. She could even laugh at herself, thinking, see, Ethan is also afraid of losing her as a friend. These things, once they happened, were bound to happen again. But it didn't happen often. They weren't passionate lovers, just seeking a little warmth from each other when they were most lonely and in pain, to forget the troubles of the world for a moment. Later, it mostly happened at Fiona's apartment, as her place was safer. Unlike Ethan, who was a high-profile singer, she was just a lyricist known by name but not faced to many, and no reporters watched her residence. Fiona gave Ethan a keypad lock. She remembered the way he almost frowned when the key was in his palm, and the way his lips tightened into a line. So Fiona stopped her greedy probing, pretending to be casual, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, saying, "Keep a spare one at your place." What she meant was, he could come whenever he wanted. But as expected, Ethan only said, "Okay, if I need it, I'll ask you for it." She didn't need that kind of spare. Ethan never used the keypad lock. Apart from physical entanglement, he was extremely measured in their other interactions, always formally asking for permission beforehand, like a student asking a teacher for help, always politely inquiring if it was convenient. Sometimes, when she was sleepless, Fiona would get annoyed thinking about it, even wanting to lie and say she'd lost the key, just to make him open the door once. But later, she changed her mind. She was afraid he would use the opportunity to return the key. She liked him unilaterally, so her worries and fears were much greater than his. Fiona felt a chill and woke from her memories. She quickly tucked the bed around her tightly, covering herself up completely, no longer thinking about the considerate, polite reply, and quickly fell into a deep sleep. After sleeping for several days, Fiona finally recovered from her illness. During that time, Ethan sent a message of concern every day. Fiona had no doubt that if she ever got delirious with fever, Ethan would notice in time and take her to the hospital. But she also understood that if things didn't reach that point, Ethan wouldn't even bother to visit, because he wanted to keep everything simple and clean, not wanting too much ambiguity to arise. After all, his last relationship hadn't ended well. But Fiona didn't understand why a past relationship could affect Ethan for 3 years. Fiona opened a video website and started searching for everything related to Ethan, as she always did before writing lyrics. She said it was to find inspiration, but it was also to find emotions. Fiona sometimes worried, wondering if she would still be able to write moving lyrics if she ever stopped liking Ethan. But such worries were fleeting. Fiona hadn't found a solution, so she wisely chose to avoid the issue. In Ethan's many videos, she could still find traces of his former lover, which fans called expired candy, but for Fiona, it was a blade that had been with her for the past 3 years, never expiring. However, it was really useful for stimulating creativity, so she couldn't help but watch one after another, torturing herself. Fiona couldn't help but wonder if Ethan knew he could have such tender eyes. Fiona was pretty as an ordinary person, perhaps even bordering on actress material. But Nina Ayres's beauty was among the top tier of actresses. The light of a firefly could never compete with the sun and moon. Fiona occasionally grumbled, guessing that Nina Ayres might be empty inside, not as talented or interesting as she was, but then she felt ignorant, boring, and even a little petty. In any case, Nina Ayres's appearance was clearly superior, and the inner qualities she didn't know about might also be brilliant, so it wasn't her place to make sour remarks in the dark. So she stopped thinking that way later. She was just sad that in the breakup that had sustained dozens of media outlets, only Nina Ayres had emerged unscathed. Fiona started writing lyrics. Ethan was releasing a single this time, and compared to his usual style, the melancholy was much lighter. If it were compared to the weather, it would be like a drizzly day, slightly damp, making people feel a little annoyed, but everyone knew that drizzle wouldn't last long and the sun would eventually come out. Fiona spent a day filling in the lyrics, half a day polishing them, and finally half a day deciding on the title. When she had inspiration, she was an efficient lyricist. Fiona sent the song past the sunken boat to Ethan's agent. Usually, she would have sent it to Ethan at the same time, because she hoped Ethan would see her talent and her resonance with him. Maybe it was because she was just recovering from a serious illness, but even just sending it to one more person made her feel too tired to move her fingers. The lyrics went smoothly. Fiona only went back and forth with Ethan's side 3 times for revisions, and then it was finalized. Fiona received the songwriting fee for this project. The songwriting fee wouldn't have been considered small 3 years ago, but today, 3 years later, it wasn't much. Fiona hadn't mentioned raising the price in the past 3 years, and the agent hadn't taken the initiative to bring it up either. Thinking about it from his perspective, Fiona could understand, but she couldn't help but think that she should raise her price next time. Because he was busy releasing a single, Ethan and Fiona didn't contact each other for a long time. Half a month later, Fiona received a message from Ethan. "Are you free today?" He must be very tired, Fiona thought, but her reply was, "It's too cold outside." She was free, but she didn't want to go out. Ethan didn't seem to want to go out either. Can I come to Fiona's apartment? Fiona paused, then replied, I haven't cleaned since I recovered from my illness last time. The apartment is full of germs. Don't come, you'll get sick. She had recovered from her cold for half a month, and she had been airing out the apartment every day. Where would the germs come from? Ethan understood that this was clearly just Fiona's excuse, so the text he was typing suddenly disappeared. The other side was silent for a while, and finally sent a polite ending. Okay, you get some rest. Fiona said, thank you. Originally one person's politeness and consideration had turned into two people's complete courteousness. Fiona thought that if it had been before, she couldn't have helped but wonder what Ethan's unfinished words were, whether he also had a hint of expectation for her. But now, she was too lazy to think about it. After typing a concluding thank you, she actually breathed a long sigh of relief, feeling much lighter. After cooperating with Ethan on this single, Fiona took a short vacation for herself. For the first 3 days, she barely left her apartment, sleeping soundly every day, relying entirely on today's advanced online applications for all her needs. Just like when she had been burning up with fever in bed, she had ended up ordering online, bothering a uniformed delivery guy to make a trip at 9 p.m., finally delivering the emergency medicine in time. When you're at your hungriest and most distressed, whether or not you have the support of someone you love doesn't seem that important. This society has long become more and more suitable for living alone. Fiona suddenly thought of these things nonsensically while washing up in front of the mirror. Perhaps it was because she thought of these things that she suddenly found the disposable items on the sink unpleasant. After staring at them for about half a minute, she suddenly picked them up one by one, finally throwing them all into the trash can for disposal. Fiona naturally wouldn't use disposable items in her own apartment. These were all for Ethan to use when he occasionally stayed over. The second time they'd been together, by mutual agreement, was definitely not a well-considered choice. They were both somewhat caught off guard, and all the toiletries had been purchased temporarily. Later, Fiona had tentatively asked if she should buy some things for him properly, so it would be more convenient for him to come and go. At that time, Ethan had paused while getting dressed, but in the end, he just smiled faintly and said that there was no need to bother, as what he had was enough. Every little thing that Ethan left in her life conveyed a message. This relationship wouldn't last long. Fiona had known it from the moment she heard his answer, but she wasn't surprised, and she didn't feel much sadness. But for some reason, recalling this at this moment, she actually hated him a little. What did she hate him for? Hating him for being too heartless? But that wasn't it either. Fiona thought for a long time, and finally understood what she hated. She hated him for being stuck in a past relationship, constantly tormenting himself, refusing to let himself go, and she also hated him for keeping people at arm's length, yet occasionally revealing his vulnerability and fatigue in front of her. But in the end, she hated herself even more. She hated herself for being captivated by a beautiful face at first sight, easily falling in love, hating herself for gradually admiring his talent, understanding his nature, and pitying his experiences, failing to escape from shallow joy in time, until she gradually fell deeper and deeper, rooted in love. In the end, it was because she had taken that one extra look at the time, and then failed to make a clean break. Thinking this way, Fiona's pointlessly arising emotions subsided again. She didn't want to wallow in these things, so she simply opened her computer and searched for her own name. It wasn't that she was narcissistic and wanted to see if there were any news about her. She simply wanted to see if people had any opinions on her lyrics. When Fiona first started writing lyrics, she was completely unknown on the internet. Even though the song she wrote for Ethan was a hit, more attention was still focused on Ethan, and no one cared what the name of a faceless lyricist was, or whether she had contributed to the song. It wasn't until she wrote more and more songs for Ethan, and Ethan became more and more popular, that someone suddenly noticed that Fiona had almost taken over the songwriting for all of Ethan's songs. Her style seemed to be in the same vein as Ethan's, or rather, they complemented each other perfectly. Ethan's success might also be due to her. That was the happiest time for Fiona, both because her work was finally recognized and because she finally saw her name mentioned in the same breath as Ethan's name. As time went on, Fiona gradually gained fame and slowly acquired many fans. She always revealed only a third of her feelings in her lyrics. Those who didn't feel it thought it was bland, but those who liked it loved her restraint. Like Ethan, Fiona gradually developed her own style and eventually became a genre of her own. But the world is often like this: when the sun reaches its zenith, it declines; when the moon is full, it wanes; when everything is at its peak, it begins to decline. As the voices praising her grew louder, those who didn't like her felt that these voices were invading their ears, and they rushed out to defend their views. Although they didn't criticize Fiona's lyrics as worthless, their words were harsh and hurtful. When Fiona first started reading them, she was depressed, and she would refute every criticism in her heart, clearly listing the reasons. But after reading more, she gradually understood that not every criticism was nonsense. Many of them were right on the mark, but she was subconsciously unwilling to admit it, so she defended herself a lot. Fiona's most common criticism was that her style was monotonous. She was good at writing about love, especially the longing for it and the greed, anger, and delusion within it. But if one song was like this, and every song was like this, it was inevitable that she would be criticized. Fiona herself was aware of this. She hadn't thought about changing it in the past because she had received a lot of love. But at this moment, she suddenly realized that she had written the so-called love and infatuation to the extreme. And if she wrote it for another 10 years, she might not have any flashes of inspiration, but would just be constantly repeating her past self. This was her bottleneck. If she couldn't break through it, then her life would be like this. Now, she just needed to ask herself, was she willing to accept that? Fiona wasn't willing. She wanted to write songs in more styles. It wasn't like she was born to be confined to love and affection. She had also laughed carefree, but after being sad for a few years, could she no longer write happy songs? Fiona was thinking this in her heart, and the scroll wheel on her mouse slipped down at random, and she saw a post about gossip. There were many gossip posts on the internet, both true and false, dazzling the eyes. If she hadn't stepped half a foot into this circle and knew some of the truth, she might have been just like many unsuspecting people, watching these posts and being dizzy, not knowing which ones to believe. Fiona wasn't interested in these posts, but she was really curious. How would she one day be mentioned in such a post? Fiona clicked on the post. The anonymous poster didn't reveal any shocking truths like the popular posts in front, but just casually listed their daily observations. Based on Fiona's own experiences and hearsay, at least 8 or 9 out of 10 of them were true, which made her even more curious. What kind of gossip about her would there be? The news about Fiona appeared in the second-to-last item. Obviously, the poster also thought it was just a trivial piece of news. I've seen Fiona Clark, who often collaborates with Ethan Wright. The two have a good private relationship. Fiona is very pretty, and she would be more popular now if she wasn't so low-key. But Ethan Wright's agent is a bit dissatisfied with her. He doesn't really like her songwriting style. He thinks that the reason why Ethan is called the backup king by haters is because Fiona's lyrics have a bad meaning. He wants to change Lyrici STS and has been in contact with potential candidates for a while, but he hasn't found a suitable one yet. After all, most big-name lyricists have long-term collaborations with other big-name singers, so it's not easy to poach them. Fiona found it difficult to describe her feelings after reading this gossip. She should be more rational and understand that these posts were often half true and half false, and some of them were hearsay from the poster, who believed it to be true, but in fact it was just spreading false information. But her intuition told her that even if this post wasn't completely true, it wasn't far from the truth either. After all, she had noticed the subtle changes in Ethan Wright's agent's attitude all along, and the occasional playful reminders. It wasn't that she hadn't really noticed them, but she had always lacked a thread to connect all the details. Fiona smiled wryly, inevitably feeling a sense of being discarded after being used. But she was naturally good at comforting herself. Thinking about it carefully, she had written so many lyrics over the years, and while she had helped Ethan Wright achieve success, Ethan Wright had in turn helped her achieve success. Perhaps without her, Ethan Wright's songs wouldn't be as classic as they are now. But without Ethan Wright, she might not have achieved today's success. In that case, no one owed anyone anything. Now, it was just a matter of parting ways amicably. Having figured this out, Fiona made plans for her future work. She had many friends in the industry in her smartphone, and sometimes wanting to collaborate with someone was just a matter of sending a message. Her work over the past 2 years had indeed been in a bottleneck, lacking a sense of innovation. But breaking through oneself was something that people who had reached a certain level in a field needed to worry about. There were many people in this industry who worked hard but never managed to get ahead. They needed someone like her to give them a hand. Fiona wasn't really worried about not finding work. It wasn't until half a month later that Ethan Wright's agent found out about this collaboration. He called her aggressively, seemingly wanting to question her, but Fiona remained calm and collected, only saying faintly, "The contract doesn't restrict me from collaborating with others, does it?" Thinking about it now, one could actually see clues in the contract signed this year. Ethan Wright's agent might have long had the intention of changing collaborators, so he had relaxed the terms for both parties a lot. The other party choked, seemingly unable to say anything for a moment. Fiona then said, "Chris, is there anything else? If not, I'll hang up first. I'm quite busy right now." Ethan Wright's agent seemed to have noticed something as well, and quickly said, "We haven't finished all the songs we agreed on this year." Fiona said, "Yes, but there aren't many left, are there?" Ethan Wright's agent was a little annoyed, but he suppressed it and asked, "Are we not collaborating next year?" Fiona was rarely honest and said, "It depends on the price. If the price is high, it's not impossible to collaborate." Ethan Wright's agent almost choked. He hurriedly exchanged a few polite words and hung up the phone. Fiona listened to the dial tone on the phone, and she stared blankly for a long time and finally smiled. If Chris Smith hadn't accompanied Ethan Wright all the way from his most humble beginnings, the two of them probably wouldn't have gotten along, would they? Although Ethan Wright was indifferent to her, at least he was upright. If he heard that she didn't plan to collaborate with him anymore, he probably wouldn't be like Chris Smith, who had clearly had the intention of discarding her after using her, but instead blamed her for taking the first step. Her departure might not mean much to Ethan Wright, and he might not even feel much reluctance, but he should sincerely wish her a bright future. Wouldn't that also be considered decent? Fiona sent Ethan Wright a message, "I changed the keypad lock at my apartment." She knew that Ethan Wright would never use that key, but that was Ethan Wright's attitude. So she still changed the lock. This was her attitude. Some things didn't need to be said too clearly. Ethan Wright would understand. "I changed the keypad lock at my apartment." This message was sent at 11 p.m. Ethan Wright could almost imagine Fiona Clark sitting in front of her computer, with her feet curled up on the chair, holding her smartphone and sending him a message. He couldn't help but think that she was staying up late writing lyrics again. When these nonsensical associations ended in his mind, Ethan Wright finally realized a problem. Fiona Clark hadn't told him the password. Perhaps she hadn't had time to send it yet, but it was already midnight when Ethan Wright saw this message, an hour after Fiona Clark had sent it. Ethan Wright thought again, perhaps she had fallen asleep. After all, this situation sometimes happened. She was extremely sleepy, but she still forced herself to talk to him, falling asleep halfway through the conversation, and then sincerely apologizing to him the next day, afraid that he would mind. Ethan Wright went to sleep, but his sleep wasn't peaceful. He dreamed of the past. In fact, he occasionally dreamed of the past these years, but more often he dreamed of the time when he and Nina Ayres had parted ways, and rarely dreamed of his smooth and happy college life. Ethan Wright was a student from a regular media academy. Fiona Clark was from the same school but a different major. She was barely considered his junior. However, the two weren't familiar with each other in school. Ethan Wright didn't even remember having met Fiona Clark. If Fiona Clark hadn't mentioned it later, he might never have known in his life that they had met 5 years ago. Ethan Wright clearly knew that he was dreaming. But he couldn't control the direction of the dream. He watched the Ethan Wright in his dream enter the library and start reading a book about the history of music. Ethan Wright remembered that he had indeed read this book back then. Although he didn't remember the specific content, he still remembered that he didn't agree with the author's views when he was reading it. He had wanted to give up on reading it several times, but in the end, he had frowned and finished reading it, out of a desire to see things through. But this dream wasn't specifically for him to recall this book that he didn't like. Ethan Wright looked up and saw Fiona Clark sitting diagonally across from him at the same desk, looking at him. 20-year-old Fiona Clark had the same small and delicate chin as 25-year-old Fiona Clark, but her cheeks hadn't been thinned by the years yet, and they had a baby-like plumpness. Seemingly not expecting that he would suddenly look over, Fiona Clark was stunned, and quickly lowered her head again, as if she had never looked at him at all. The Ethan Wright in the dream didn't delve into it, and only thought of it as a chance encounter. The scenes in the dream changed very quickly. Ethan Wright saw himself riding a bicycle on campus, his wide white t-shirt billowing in the wind, and then he saw himself wearing headphones, eating alone in the cafeteria, his face full of stay away. These fragmented scenes pieced together were his unrestrained youth. Ethan Wright wasn't a withdrawn person. He had several close friends in college, but he was essentially a person who was primarily self-sufficient, so he mostly spent his time alone. But when Ethan Wright looked at everything in the dream from a third-person perspective, he found that Fiona Clark was always in the picture. Fiona Clark hadn't been looking at him from the beginning. In the beginning, she rode her bicycle and passed him by, just turning her head to chat and laugh with others, not looking at him. Or in the empty cafeteria, she chose a rare empty table in the corner, facing him, but she only glanced at the arrogant and uninhibited over-ear headphones on his head, and didn't linger on his face for a moment. In the crowded library, one had to turn the angle around to see the figure of the girl sitting back to back with him. Gradually, after coincidences caused by similar routines and similar routes, Fiona Clark began to notice him. Occasionally, when they met on the road, she would secretly look at him twice, and then pass by as if nothing had happened. Having seen too many of her calm expressions, and then seeing her still immature performance in the dream, Ethan Wright actually felt that even her expressionless expression had become vivid. Fiona Clark appeared in front of him more and more often, sharing the same desk, the same dining table, and even the same shade of a tree by the playground. She looked at him, but she also stopped at looking at him, as if that was enough. Ethan Wright's heart was like being hung up, parched, expectant, but never satisfied. He almost lost his clear will in the dream, and he couldn't understand what he was waiting for. Suddenly, the colors of the dream changed. Nina Ayres appeared. Nina Ayres shouldn't have appeared at this time. He had only met her after graduation. Thinking of this, Ethan Wright, who was almost obsessed with finding Fiona Clark in the corner of the screen, suddenly woke up. This was just a dream, not the real past. So, maybe Fiona Clark had never looked at him that way. In his dream, Ethan Wright was with Nina Ayres. The process of being together and separating was no different from reality. It was just a matter of conquering the eyes first, then genuinely moving the heart, and finally being abandoned, his pride crushed, leaving him resentful for years. In the beginning, Ethan didn't want to recall this past. For a while, he even seriously wondered if he had some inherent flaw that couldn't be changed, which led his soulmate to abandon him without mercy. Ethan was muddle-headed for a long time. Later, he couldn't even distinguish whether his resentment was because he still had feelings for Nina Ayres, or because Nina Ayres had changed her mind before him, leaving the always proud boy behind, discarded like trash. But even the greatest resentment was worn down by the years, losing its sharp edges, and turning into a lurking insect in the shadows, occasionally gnawing at his heart when he was unprepared. Painful and unpleasant. But that was all. Ethan had long lost interest in this outdated, melodramatic drama and didn't want to watch it anymore. He began to wonder, where was Fiona Clark? Unfortunately, this dream didn't shift according to his will. The more he tried to find Fiona's figure, the harder it was to find her. He could only be patient and search for her face in the corners of each frame. Then Ethan discovered that Fiona Clark was slowly ceasing to look at him, nor did she show that calm expression with deliberately restrained yet lightly trembling eyelashes. Strangers started to appear by her side. At first, there were 2 or 3 unfamiliar faces, but soon, the people around her became fixed, and they began to get close. Fiona Clark would hold his hand and give a sweet smile when the young man looked down at her tenderly, leaning her face on his arm. Fiona Clark. He called her name, reaching out to touch her figure, but everything in front of him shattered like light and shadow. A sharp pain shot through Ethan's heart, as if even breathing had become difficult. Ethan woke up from the dream, finding himself covered in cold sweat, the feeling of palpitations still lingering. He touched his heart and breathed deeply. He had a nightmare. Ethan's mind was blank for a while as he tried to recall what he had dreamed of, but the once clear images became so blurred after waking up. In the end, he could only remember one name: Fiona Clark. But how could a dream with Fiona Clark be a nightmare? Ethan glanced at his smartphone. 6 o'clock. He got up and poured himself a glass of water, the living room pitch black without the lights on. Ethan sat at the dining table, took a sip of water, and suddenly began to contemplate a question: what kind of existence was Fiona Clark to him? When Ethan first met Fiona Clark, he thought she was very similar to him, both being naturally indifferent people. But the more they interacted, the more he felt that Fiona Clark was the complete opposite of him. His initial help to her could hardly be considered a promotion or a recognition of talent, it was more like mutual achievement. But in the years that followed, she had always been by his side, acting as his nameless and faceless partner, always prioritizing collaborations with him, turning down good opportunities for it, which he knew something about. Ethan, being such an indifferent person, had advised her twice, urging her to think more about herself. At that time, Fiona Clark only smiled, showing her dimples shyly, and said that working with him was the best thing, so how could it be considered not thinking of herself? Ethan now realized that his advice might not have been entirely sincere, because he was clearly harboring expectations, hoping that Fiona Clark would reject his persuasion. And Fiona Clark did indeed meet his expectations, giving him a despicable, unspeakable sense of security. Ethan never advised her again. From then on, they were the best work partners, not exactly close friends, but being together always felt comfortable. Until that night, they crossed the line. Ethan couldn't really remember who took the first step. He only knew that when he was embracing her, the hole in his heart that seemed to be constantly blowing wind like a bellows, was suddenly filled. Quiet, gentle, and quietly leaving after a night. The subtle change in their relationship made Ethan a little at a loss, but Fiona Clark was much more generous than him. She didn't take that night too seriously, and they didn't become lovers. Ethan didn't know how to describe his feelings. It was as if he was waiting for a shoe to drop, but that shoe never came. It would be a lie to say he didn't know Fiona Clark liked him. Being cherished, cared for with warmth and attention, how could he be unaware? But it would also be a lie to say he knew Fiona Clark liked him. Ethan no longer had the arrogance of his youth, daring to assume that someone would unconditionally and unrequitedly like him. Moreover, Fiona Clark hid herself so well, her smile appearing and disappearing, her concern neither too close nor too distant, tightly guarding the line of friendship, never crossing it. But in the end, Ethan enjoyed everything as it was. Because Fiona Clark was by his side, even if it was this faint, non-advancing, non-retreating relationship, he already felt content. So he quietly maintained this balance, never thinking deeply about whether he needed to risk confirming something that was very important to both him and her. Until today, the weight left the scale on its own, and his balance was lost. Ethan sat blankly in the living room until 8 o'clock, the morning light filling the hall through the non-light blocking curtains in the living room. Fiona Clark still hadn't sent the second half of the message that Ethan was expecting, and this time, he could no longer convince himself with the excuse that maybe Fiona Clark hasn't woken up yet. The messaging app history stopped 2 weeks ago, the last sentence being Fiona Clark's, about changing the keypad lock. Ethan stared at the messaging app interface, wondering if he could see any hidden meaning. The makeup artist walked in. Ethan turned off the smartphone screen, but even looking at a black screen, he could reconstruct the interface in his mind, almost perfectly replicating Fiona Clark's every word. The makeup artist's technique was skilled and gentle, casually striking up a conversation with him. Ethan remained polite but distinctly distant, so the young woman no longer bothered. When Chris Smith came in, he only felt that it was quiet inside, and the atmosphere seemed not very good, but upon closer inspection, he felt that it was no different from usual, so he didn't delve deeper. He came over to confirm the script questions with Ethan again. Today was just a simple interview, but the interviewer was not the usual program team. To be on the safe side, Chris Smith could only confirm the outline of the answers with Ethan again and again to avoid him saying something inappropriate. Ethan agreed verbally, but looked distracted. If Chris Smith had been a little more careful, he would have noticed that something was wrong with him. But Chris Smith only thought that if Ethan agreed, there would be no problem. After all, even when he broke up with Nina Ayres, Ethan hadn't made a mistake in front of the media. He was a person with extremely strong self-esteem and wouldn't allow himself to wallow in negative emotions, let alone bring his emotions to work. As an agent, Chris Smith had always found Ethan very worry-free, which made his life very comfortable. After a long time of comfortable days, he began to fail to understand others. But he didn't know that there were always exceptions. When the string is stretched too tight, it may break. The previous routine questions went smoothly until the host asked, "Our audience is very eager to know, Ethan, what is your ideal type?" Chris Smith knew that thanks to Ethan's face, he had a considerable number of girlfriend fans, so the prepared answers, while avoiding media associations with Nina Ayres, were all designed to please those potential fans. But Ethan was silent. Faced with this unexpected silence, the host leaned forward a little, but the words came to her lips, and she still smoothed things over, smiling and saying, "Why are you thinking so seriously?" Ethan raised his eyes and said, "I like quiet, gentle, and talented girls." This was different from the outline provided by Chris Smith. Although it didn't describe someone in detail, it vaguely revealed a little bit of direction. But the host didn't show any doubt and continued to ask, "Do you have any requirements for body shape and appearance?" Ethan was stunned. A figure appeared in his mind. In the end, he just smiled. Seeing him pursing his lips and not speaking, the host didn't push him any further and skillfully diverted the topic. It wasn't until a long time later, when Ethan could talk about this matter generously, that everyone knew that he smiled at this time because he was thinking of someone, but he couldn't say to the host the height should be the same as hers, and the nose, eyes, and mouth should be like hers, so in the end, it could only turn into a smile of remembering someone. Chris Smith, outside the camera, already felt that things were beginning to get out of control, but having not dealt with this kind of situation for a long time, with his panic, the only way he could think of in the end was to wait. Fortunately, apart from this one question, Ethan didn't take matters into his own hands on other questions and answers, which made Chris Smith's hanging heart drop a little bit. The host and Ethan asked and answered, all the way to the last interactive segment. "Please contact a friend in the industry and ask him to promote your new song." Ethan had originally contacted a young actor who became popular because he played the male lead in his music video. He had a very good relationship with him and was willing to help him with this small favor. But perhaps because he had been frequently thinking of Fiona Clark today, Ethan changed his mind. He said to the host, "Let me try first. I'm not sure if I can get through." Maybe she wouldn't answer his smartphone. Although he knew that with her personality, she wouldn't say anything. Oh, the extreme, but would gently and shallowly hint to him until he understood, and would never do such dramatic things as blacklisting and deleting him. Instead, she had an extraordinary trust in him, believing that he would handle everything with gentlemanly grace and would never disturb her life after such a hint. But he was still afraid that she had rejected all ways for him to enter her life. After all, not everything can unfold like a deduction. He was far from being as restrained and understanding as she thought. He wanted to see her. If not, then talking would be good too. Ethan despicably found a reason to do a show for himself, as if this would save him from having to dissect his true heart to seek a test, and even if she rejected him decisively, he could smile, look cheerful, and act as if nothing had happened. The host originally thought that Ethan was just cooperating and acting, making the traces of the script as shallow as possible, and naturally asked along the script, "Who are you contacting?" Ethan said, "My lyricist, Fiona Clark." Of course, the host knew Fiona Clark. Before interviewing Ethan, she had done her homework seriously, and privately, she also liked to listen to Ethan's songs. Unlike most girls who liked Ethan's songs, she was much more interested in the lyricist Fiona Clark than the singer and composer Ethan. Moreover, this was also different from the script. The smile on the host's face became more genuine. Without looking at Ethan's manager, who she knew must be jumping mad, she was happy to give Ethan this opportunity to deviate from the script. Ethan pressed the call button. The call wasn't answered immediately. He looked at the smartphone, his face expressionless, but his hands were already clenched tightly together. The smartphone was connected. Ethan heard a long-lost voice. Fiona Clark felt a little strange when she received Ethan's call. She hesitated for a while before answering. She originally wanted to wait for Ethan to speak first, but a second or two passed, and Ethan didn't speak, so she had to say softly, "Hello?" There was not too much sleepiness in Fiona Clark's voice, but Ethan remembered the tone and breath sounds when she spoke. How could he not tell the little bit of drowsiness that hadn't completely dissipated? The interview had been recorded until now, and it was 4:30 a.m. Ethan originally thought she was awake, but he didn't expect to disturb her. Ethan said, "Did I wake you up? I'm really sorry." The host didn't understand how Ethan could tell that Fiona Clark was originally sleeping. In the end, she could only attribute it to Ethan being extremely familiar with Fiona Clark's schedule, and a gossip heart arose. After apologizing, Ethan said to Fiona Clark, "I'm being interviewed now. The host said to find a friend to help me promote my new song. Among the people I know, no one knows those new songs better than you." Look at him, how grandstanding. Seeing that Ethan mentioned the program team, the host also took the opportunity to say a few words to Fiona Clark. Fiona Clark was obviously a little confused about the current situation, but she was slow-tempered, spoke softly, and chatted patiently with the host for a few words, and quickly figured out the situation while filling the host with goodwill. Fiona Clark had many doubts in her heart, but the reason given by Ethan was not far-fetched. Even if she felt it was strange that Ethan chose to contact her, Fiona Clark still decided to follow along and complete this performance. It was not difficult to praise Ethan and Ethan's works. If she didn't sincerely appreciate him, Fiona Clark wouldn't have liked him so unrequitedly for so many years. When mentioning Ethan's main new song, "The Sunken Boat Has Passed," Fiona Clark paused and subconsciously said a heartfelt sentence, "This is my favorite of his compositions." The host said, "Why is it your favorite?" Fiona Clark said, "Ethan's songs are actually more or less melancholic. Although this one hasn't completely jumped out of this style, it gives people a faint feeling of the rain about to clear. Maybe it's a change of mood. I now prefer this kind of moist, but also with the breath of early sunshine, songs." Wow, as expected of a lyricist, the emotions are very delicate. So what is the meaning of the name of this song, "The Sunken Boat Has Passed"? The host was very supportive. Fiona Clark still remembered that this was not her main stage and joked, "You have to ask Ethan, can you say it?" In the past, for each song, they would have a very in-depth exchange of creative ideas, striving to make the emotions of the music and lyrics more closely integrated. Only for this one, Ethan told Fiona Clark, but didn't hear Fiona Clark's feedback. Ethan said, "Of course." Fiona Clark smiled softly and said, "This name is taken from Liu Yushi's 1,000 sails pass by the sunken boat, and 10,000 trees flourish in front of the diseased tree." The meaning is not exactly the same, but it only takes its auspicious meaning of prosperity and endless life. I hope everyone can bravely open a new chapter in their lives and not be immersed in the past full of regrets and unmet desires. I always feel that life doesn't have to be perfect in everything. It's most rare to be able to see it open-mindedly and live happily. At this moment, the host almost forgot that she was being interviewed and almost thought she was confiding in a close girlfriend. Fortunately, she was well trained, not only woke up in time but also quickly offered praise. But when she turned her head, she suddenly noticed that the corners of the singer's mouth, who had always been known for his indifference, which had been slightly smiling since the call was connected, had gradually dropped at this moment, and his eyebrows and eyes were stunned, looking a bit difficult to hide his sadness. Ethan understood that Fiona Clark's words were not deliberately said for him to hear, but it was really difficult for him not to listen to these words. After all, from these words, he suddenly understood that no matter whether the vague feelings he had felt before were true or false, from now on, for Fiona Clark, they were all a sunken and unrecoverable past. The host, timing it, asked Fiona Clark the last question. "Do you and Ethan have any future creative plans that you can reveal to us a little bit?" Fiona Clark smiled and said, "It's hard to say what will happen in the future. We have indeed had many collaborations over the years, mainly because our styles are compatible. But we are not people who are content with the status quo. We want to try more styles and seek self-breakthroughs. Whether we will continue to cooperate in the future depends on the specific works." Fiona Clark's words were diplomatic, not shifting responsibility to anyone. Ethan was a little lost. The sunken boat has passed, the sunken boat has passed. She was a small boat quietly leaving the sunken boat. But he was the sunken boat that plunged into the water and could never float up again. Letting go of a person is a repeated process. One determination is useless. You have to cut off your thoughts again and again when you waver and feel unwilling, and finally you can truly let go. It took Fiona Clark a full half a year from making a decision to completely letting go. But in this half year, she didn't just do this one thing. Fiona Clark began to try different styles of lyrics, giving up most useless entertainment for this. In order to write a song related to Buddhism and Taoism, she could turn over most of the scriptures and classics. If she carefully described a piece of ancient prose, she had to read the entire history. Fortunately, such hard work was not wasted. She suffered enough before writing the lyrics, and the ridicule she received for the lyrics was much less. Fiona Clark's transformation was much easier than her predecessors. Gradually, she was no longer a spokesperson for the bitter love genre. When people mentioned her, they no longer bundled her with Ethan, as if she was his buy one get one free promotion. Fiona Clark still occasionally cooperated with Ethan, just as she said to Chris Smith, "Everything is easy to say if the price is right." After all, she still hopes to work hard when she is young so that she can achieve financial freedom as soon as possible, and Ethan is indeed a worry-free partner. It's just that she no longer leaves most of her energy to him. Ethan called to congratulate her on the great success of her new song with others. Fiona Clark felt a little emotional listening to his gentle voice on the other end of the smartphone. In fact, in the past 6 months, after Ethan returned to the position of friend, he treated her even more gently and affectionately than before. It seemed that after knowing that she had given up her thoughts, Ethan didn't have to force himself to pretend to be distant, but could instead reveal his gentle nature, which could be considered comfortable. Thinking this way, Fiona Clark felt that her behavior of cutting her losses in time and getting out was beneficial to both of them. Ethan would probably only smile bitterly if he knew what she was thinking, but he didn't know at this moment, so he could continue to say, "I've been looping it for several days. Your lyrics this time are really well written. If you hadn't written the lyrics, this song wouldn't be as popular as it is now." Every word he said was from the heart. The song written by the younger generation was indeed good and made him, a senior, feel a lot of crisis, but it wasn't to the extent that the younger generation could be compared with him. He liked this song, all because of Fiona Clark's talent. Being affirmed is always happy, even if he knew that when Ethan congratulated her, even if it was out of politeness, it was impossible to say that her lyrics were not well written. Fiona Clark couldn't help but pursed her lips and smiled. After smiling, she skillfully complimented Ethan commercially a few times, and also congratulated him on the success of his new song. Ethan said softly, "That's not my best song." He kept his best songs to cooperate with her, waiting for her to write the lyrics, but her best lyrics were no longer written for him. Fiona Clark didn't go into this sentence deeply, only greeted him with a smile and quickly ended the call. She used to be extremely sensitive to every word and sentence that Ethan said, and could speculate on the emotions of 100 twists and turns from one word. But from the moment she let go, she put away those affectionate tentacles, didn't make rash judgments, and didn't have delusions. Ethan's smartphone had only been hung up for a short time, and the rising star who had just cooperated with Fiona Clark called again. The young man was 2 years younger than Fiona Clark and was at the age where he was so tender that water could be squeezed out of him. He had a small tiger tooth when he smiled, which was completely a heart-throbbing appearance. The young man chatted with Fiona Clark about everything, and finally pretended to casually invite Fiona Clark to have dinner together. Although the young man had at least pulled some pretexts as a fig leaf, Fiona Clark was not so stupid as to believe it. Fiona Clark hesitated for a moment, and finally declined, pretending not to notice the loss in the young man's words. The young man didn't have as many fans as Ethan, but his girlfriend fans far surpassed Ethan. After all, Ethan didn't like to cooperate with the brokerage company to do too many activities unrelated to singing, and he was too lazy to manage the so-called persona. But the young man had a lot of ambition in this area. He was a singer and an actor. When he was tired, he would cheer up and play the image that fans liked. Fiona Clark admired him, but she was not willing to wade into this muddy water because of this admiration. The young man was young after all, and probably hadn't thought about whether the fan base he attracted would allow him to be in love at this time, and how much pressure the person who joined hands with him would have to bear. He was young after all, and Fiona Clark was unwilling to suffer this. Of course, in the final analysis, she just didn't like him, otherwise, why would she be like this, not even willing to try? However, the appearance of the young man also reminded Fiona Clark that the previous unsuccessful unrequited love was a thing of the past for her. If she could meet someone who would make her heart flutter again, maybe she should seize the opportunity and open a new chapter in her life. For Fiona Clark, every day she experiences now is a brand new, worthy of expectation day. But for Ethan, he was trapped in the past and hadn't moved forward for half a year. The only benefit of emotional setbacks was that in the past 6 months, his talent had become more abundant and he had written many quite amazing songs. Sometimes, he would sit in the music room in the middle of the night and sing the past songs over and over again. He couldn't help but wonder if Fiona Clark was thinking of him when she wrote those lyrics, just like he was thinking of her when he created them. It's funny to say that Ethan has been heartbroken for half a year, sad for half a year, but no one around him knows. Of course, they felt that Ethan was more indifferent than before, but Ethan never embarrassed people, so they didn't delve deeper. No one noticed that something was wrong with him. Chris Smith, who was the only one who had noticed something, also terminated his contract with Ethan peacefully 3 months ago. The termination of the contract was proposed by Ethan. Chris Smith initially disagreed until Ethan said to him, "Chris, you're right to have accompanied me from my humble beginnings, but conversely, haven't I accompanied you through your low point? The few seedlings you have in your hands now are very potential. Maybe one day they can soar into the sky, but if it were you back then, would you have the confidence to sign them? For what you have done for me over the years, whether the results are good or bad, I appreciate your kindness, but I never feel that I owe you anything. What do you say?" When the words reached this point, Chris Smith also felt Ethan's determination to terminate the contract and understood that terminating the contract at this time was at least a good ending, and keeping it in hand was considered a network, so he gritted his teeth and agreed. However, no matter how pragmatic he was, he still felt angry in his heart, and inevitably ridiculed Ethan a few times. First Fiona Clark left you, then you drove me away, dismantling the former team to pieces. Do you want to be a loner? Mentioning Fiona Clark, Ethan's heart moved. He understood very well that even if Chris Smith was one of the reasons for Fiona Clark leaving him, it was only the most insignificant one. The root cause was still in himself. But the wrong things were wrong, and he had to correct them one by one. Ethan didn't directly respond to Chris Smith's words but explained the reason for terminating the contract with him, which could be considered the last consideration for an old friend. Actually, our styles of doing things have always been different. In the past, I felt that I could tolerate it, but now I understand that if something needs to be tolerated to continue to be promoted, maybe it was incorrect in the first place. The longer it drags on, the more regrettable things will happen. It's not that you're wrong, but that we're really not suitable to be partners. Maybe Chris Smith will understand in the future, but at that time he didn't realize the leeway that Ethan had left for him as much as possible. After the two parted ways, the media inexplicably hyped you. The old news about Ethan and Nina airs again. The degree was not too excessive, but Ethan would occasionally feel a little annoyed when he saw it. Ethan didn't think about whether this trivial matter had anything to do with Chris Smith. Firstly, it didn't hurt his muscles and bones, and secondly, Chris Smith and Nina Ayres were both people of the past for him and were not worth his excessive attention. Ethan thought that his self-esteem was not worth much, but he was always a person who lived his life guarding his worthless self-esteem. When he broke up with Nina Ayres, he asked why. Nina Ayres didn't answer, and he never asked again. Even if this inexplicable breakup caused him a long period of pain and unwillingness, he didn't intend to put down his self-esteem and ask a second time. And today, that reason is worthless to him, because he no longer has a trace of residual feelings for Nina Ayres. He wanted to use the same method to let go of Fiona Clark. After all, Fiona Clark, after making a decision, looked much happier and more at ease than before. He didn't have the confidence to do better than this. Because he predicted that the result was destined to be a failure, Ethan chose to give up from the beginning, so as not to damage that little bit of pitiful dignity. He stood in the position of a friend, maintaining a distance that was neither too close nor too far from Fiona Clark, counting the frequency, and occasionally caring within the scope that was not subtly noticeable. Ethan thought this was enough. After all, they used to be like this, neither too close nor too far, a step away, but it gradually made him feel complete. But when he really did this, he realized that he was wrong. Now is completely different from before. The biggest difference is that Fiona Clark no longer likes him. Those eyes that always watched him now contain more characters and scenery, and can no longer hold a small him. And such a small gaze changed his entire world. Ethan made a decision he had never thought of. I like you. I started liking you earlier than I realized myself. But I'm very cowardly. After vaguely realizing that you liked me, my instinctive reaction was to stop here. Because I was afraid that if I asked for too much, I would lose everything I had already gained. But I forgot to think about it for you. To think about whether you would be willing to continue this kind of liking without getting any feedback. So I deserve to lose you. A lot of people say that if someone really likes you, they'll make the first move. I guess that's what you thought too, so you chose to give up. I wasn't a believer in that saying before, but right now, I think it might be true. Because here I am, unable to resist seeing you. Even risking rejection, even risking losing you as a friend, I want to confess my feelings. He arrived at Fiona Clark's apartment, looking at the keypad lock with a mix of amusement and heartache. Ethan Wright took a deep breath, mentally rehearsing the words he had prepared, before pressing the doorbell.